They sealed the records. For decades, no one was allowed to speak the family name in certain counties. When modern geneticists finally opened the case files in 2018, 3 of them requested immediate psychiatric leave. What they discovered wasn't just a dynasty. It was a biological crime scene that had been breeding in silence for over 200 years. This is the story of a family that turned isolation into something unspeakable. A bloodline so tangled that when scientists tried to map it, the software kept crashing, because what they were looking at wasn't supposed to be possible. Not in America, not for this long, not without anyone stopping it. The family called themselves the Goler clan, but that name means nothing to most people, and that's exactly how they wanted it. Hidden deep in the valleys of Nova Scotia, they built their own world, a world with its own rules. Its own marriages, its own children, and when the outside world finally broke through their gates in 1984, what they found wasn't just abuse. It was a genetic catastrophe written into the bones of children who didn't even know they were victims. But here's what makes this story different from every other tale of isolated horror you've heard. This wasn't a cult. There was no charismatic leader, no ideology, no manifesto, just a family that decided, generation after generation, that the outside world didn't matter. That bloodlines could be kept pure by keeping them close. So close that by the end, children were being born to parents who shared the same grandparents, the same great-grandparents, sometimes the same parent. When police finally raided the compound, they found children who couldn't speak properly, who had never seen a television, who didn't know what a school was. And when doctors examined them, they found something that made even hardened investigators go silent. Physical deformities that only occur when the family tree stops branching, when it loops back on itself, again and again and again. This is not a ghost story. This is not folklore. This is documented. This is real, and it happened in a country that thought it had left this kind of darkness behind centuries ago. The Goler clan didn't start as monsters. They started as survivors. In the early 1800s, a man named William Goler arrived in Nova Scotia with nothing but a wife and a dream of land no one else wanted. He found it, deep in the South Mountain Valley, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by forests so thick that even hunters avoided it. He built a cabin, then another, and slowly the Goler family began to grow. But here's where the isolation became a decision. When William's children came of age, they didn't leave. They didn't marry into neighboring families. They married each other, cousins to cousins, and when their children were born, those children did the same. It wasn't called incest then. It was called keeping the land in the family, keeping the bloodline strong, keeping outsiders out. By the 1900s, the Golers had become something else entirely, a closed loop, a genetic echo chamber. The family tree had stopped growing outward. It was now growing inward, collapsing on itself like a dying star. And with each generation, the damage compounded. Cleft palates, crooked spines, cognitive delays, children born with faces that didn't quite fit together. And still, the family kept to itself. The outside world barely knew they existed. Occasionally, a Goler would come into town to trade furs or buy supplies. They were quiet, strange. They smelled like wood smoke and something sour that people couldn't place. Shopkeepers would serve them quickly and watch them leave. No one asked questions. No one wanted to know. But inside the valley, behind the trees and the rotting fences, something far darker than poverty was taking root. The children weren't just marrying their cousins anymore. Fathers were taking daughters, brothers were taking sisters, uncles were taking nieces, and when babies were born from these unions, they were kept, raised in the same cabins, fed the same lies, told that this was normal, that this was family. By the 1970s, There were over 30 people living in the Golar compound. Most of them were related by blood 3 or 4 different ways. Some of the children didn't know who their real parents were because the adults refused to say. Others knew, and that knowledge sat inside them like poison. There were no birthdays, no schooling, no calendar. Time moved differently in that valley. Seasons passed, children grew, and the family consumed itself, bite by bite, year by year. And no one on the outside heard a thing. The first crack in the silence came from a child who wasn't supposed to speak. In 1984, a 14-year-old girl stumbled into a neighboring farm, barefoot, covered in bruises, and barely able to form sentences. She had run for miles through the forest, away from something she couldn't yet put into words. The farmer who found her didn't call the police right away. He called a doctor, because what he saw on that girl's body wasn't just neglect. It was evidence of something that made his hands shake when he picked up the phone. When social workers arrived, the girl tried to explain, but her vocabulary was so limited, so childlike, that at first they thought she was mentally disabled. She wasn't. She had simply never been taught to speak about what was happening to her. There were no words in her world for rape, no words for father as abuser, no framework to describe a house where everyone was both victim and participant. So she spoke in fragments, in gestures, in silent, 1,000-yard stares that told the story her mouth couldn't. The police decided to go in. What they expected was a welfare case, a poor family, maybe some neglect. What they found was a compound that looked like it had been abandoned by time itself. Rotting shacks, no running water, no electricity, piles of trash and animal bones scattered in the yard, and inside, huddled in the dark, were children. So many children, some as young as 5, all of them dirty, all of them afraid, and all of them related in ways that made the officers stop writing in their notepads and just stare. They separated the children from the adults and began to ask questions. Slowly, gently, and what came out was a horror show that had been running for generations. One girl, 11 years old, said her father had been raping her since she was 6. Another said her grandfather and uncle took turns. A boy, barely 8, described being sodomized by multiple adult men in the family, and when investigators asked why no one had ever told anyone, the answers were all the same. We didn't know it was wrong. We thought every family did this. That's the part that breaks you, not the abuse itself, though that's unforgivable. It's the realization that these children had been so isolated, so controlled, that they didn't even have the language to recognize their own suffering. They had been raised inside a nightmare and told it was normal, and because no one from the outside ever came, because no neighbors ever knocked, because the authorities never checked, the nightmare just kept going. Year after year, child after child, when the forensic teams finally began collecting evidence, they found semen stains on mattresses that had been used by children. They found photographs, diaries, and they found medical records that would later be used to map the family tree. A tree that looked less like a tree and more like a knot, a tangle of lines that looped back on themselves so many times that geneticists would later say it was one of the most extreme cases of multi-generational incest ever documented in North America. 16 adults were arrested, the children were taken into custody, and the world finally learned the name Golar. But by then, the damage was already done. The trials began in 1985, and the courtroom became a place where language failed. Prosecutors stood in front of juries and tried to explain what had happened in that valley, but every sentence felt inadequate. How do you describe a family where a man is simultaneously a father, grandfather, and uncle to the same child? How do you explain to 12 ordinary citizens that this wasn't a single crime, but a system, a tradition passed down like recipes or folk songs? except what was being passed down was rape. The defendants sat in silence. Most of them didn't understand what they had done wrong. In their minds, they had simply lived the way their parents lived, the way their grandparents lived. When asked why they had sexually abused children, some of them looked genuinely confused. One man said, "That's just what we did." Another said, "It's family business." There was no remorse, no shame, just a hollow, chilling blankness, as if morality had never entered the valley in the first place. The children testified, and that was the hardest part, because these were children who had never been in a building with fluorescent lights, who had never seen a judge or a lawyer, who didn't understand what a courtroom was. They sat in chairs too big for them and answered questions in broken, hesitant voices. Some of them cried, some of them didn't, and some of them defended their abusers because those abusers were the only family they had ever known. Love and horror had been so twisted together in their minds that they couldn't tell the difference anymore. The verdicts came down one by one: guilty, 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 16 convictions, sentences ranging from 8 months to 15 years. And when it was over, the survivors were scattered, placed in foster homes across Nova Scotia, given new names, new lives, told to forget. But you don't forget something like that. You carry it in your bones, in your blood, in the way you flinch when someone touches you, in the way you can't ever fully trust that the world is safe. The compound was burned, the land was seized, and the Goler name became a cautionary tale whispered in social work offices and psychology seminars. But here's the thing no one talks about. The survivors didn't just carry trauma, they carried genes, damaged, tangled, compromised genes. And when scientists finally got permission to study the medical records, what they found was a genetic profile that looked like it had been put through a blender. Children born with cranial deformities, cleft lips, heart defects, cognitive impairments, shortened lifespans, the kind of damage that only happens when DNA is forced to replicate itself with almost no variation, when the same genetic code is copied and copied and copied until the errors pile up like static on a broken recording. Some of the children would never be able to live independently, some would struggle with mental illness their entire lives, and some would die young, their bodies simply unable to survive the genetic lottery they had lost before they were even born. The Goler clan didn't just destroy lives, they destroyed biology. They took the most basic human process, reproduction, and turned it into a weapon. And the scars of that weapon are still visible today, written into the medical histories of people who never asked to be born into that bloodline. But here's the question no one wanted to ask in 1984, and it's the question that still haunts researchers today. How did this happen for so long without anyone noticing? How did an entire family commit generational atrocities in a valley less than 50 miles from functioning towns, schools, and churches, and no one intervened? The answer is more disturbing than the crimes themselves. Because people did know, they just didn't care enough to stop it. Local residents admitted, years later, that they had heard rumors, strange sounds coming from the Goler property at night, children seen in town with bruises and blank expressions. A family that never sent their kids to school, never went to a doctor, never participated in anything resembling normal society. But rural Nova Scotia in the mid-20th century operated on a code of silence. You minded your business, you didn't ask questions, and you certainly didn't get involved in what another family did on their own land. So the Golers were left alone, not because no one suspected, but because suspicion wasn't enough to break the unwritten rule, stay out of it. Even the authorities failed. Social workers had been tipped off multiple times over the decades. Teachers reported children who looked malnourished and couldn't read. Neighbors called about neglect, but every time the system found a reason not to act. Lack of evidence, lack of resources, lack of jurisdiction. The goalers lived far enough off the grid that it was easier to close the file than to drive out there and confront what everyone feared might be true. And so the files were closed again and again and again. This wasn't just a failure of one family, it was a failure of society, a collective decision to look away because looking directly at something that dark requires action. And action requires courage, and courage, it turns out, is a lot rarer than people like to admit. By the time the case went public, journalists descended on Nova Scotia like vultures. They wanted the story. The sensational, horrifying, can you believe this happened story, but what they found was a community that didn't want to talk. People refused interviews, turned cameras away. Some even defended the goalers, saying they were just poor folk who kept to themselves, as if poverty excused rape, as if isolation justified incest. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, but it revealed something true about human nature. We protect the monsters we know because confronting them means confronting our own complicity in letting them exist. And here's where it gets personal. If you're still watching this, you're already braver than most, because most people would have clicked away by now. They'd say it's too dark, too disturbing, too much. But you're still here, and that means you understand something important. That evil doesn't look like a movie villain. It looks like neglect, like silence, like a community that shrugs and says, "Not my problem." So ask yourself this. If you had lived in that town, in that time, and you had heard the rumors, would you have done something? Or would you have been one of the people who looked the other way? Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was happening in your community? Because the truth is, it's still happening, maybe not in the same way, but isolation, abuse, silence, they're still out there, and the question isn't whether evil exists, it's whether we're willing to stop it. The survivors grew up, or at least their bodies did, but growing up and healing are not the same thing. By the late 1990s, social workers began tracking what had happened to the children who were rescued from the Gola compound. The results were devastating. Over 60% had attempted suicide at least once. Nearly all of them struggled with addiction, alcohol, drugs, anything to quiet the noise inside their heads. Many couldn't hold jobs, couldn't maintain relationships, couldn't trust anyone, including themselves. One woman, now in her 40s, gave an interview under a false name in 2003. She described what it was like to grow up knowing that her father was also her grandfather, that her mother was also her half-sister, that her own children, born years later to a man outside the family, carried genetic markers that doctors flagged as high risk. She said the worst part wasn't the abuse itself. It was the realization, years later, that her entire identity was built on a lie, that she didn't even know who she really was. Because when your family tree is a circle, there's no origin point, no starting place. Just an endless loop of damage echoing backward and forward through time. Another survivor described the nightmares, not the kind where you wake up and feel relieved it was just a dream, the kind where you wake up and realize the nightmare was your childhood. And it was real, and it will never stop being real. He said he tried therapy, tried medication, tried religion, nothing worked. Because how do you forgive people who didn't even know they were hurting you? How do you process trauma that was normalized, that was woven into the fabric of your entire existence? Some of the survivors never spoke publicly at all. They changed their names, moved to different provinces, built new lives on top of the old ones, like covering a wound with a bandage and hoping it never reopens. But genetics don't forget. Several of the women who grew up in the compound later gave birth to children with mental disabilities, heart defects, seizure disorders. The The doctors tried to be gentle, but the message was clear. The damage done to their DNA was still active, still unfolding. Their children, and possibly their children's children, would carry the biological consequences of what happened in that valley. And then there were the ones who didn't survive at all. 3 former Gola children died by suicide before they turned 30. One overdosed in a motel room in Halifax. Another walked into the ocean and never came back. The third left a note that said only, "I was born wrong." No name, no explanation. Just 5 words that summarized a lifetime of stolen innocence and inherited shame. The outside world moved on. The trials ended. The news cycle shifted. The Gola case became a footnote in criminal justice textbooks and a case study in forensic psychology courses. But for the survivors, there was no moving on. There was only endurance. Waking up every day in a body that remembered what the mind tried to forget. Living in a world that expected them to be normal when normal had never been an option. And here's the cruelest part. Some of them still loved their abusers. Because love, in a closed system, doesn't follow the rules. It gets twisted, corrupted. A girl who was raped by her father still remembered him reading her stories when she was small. A boy who was beaten by his uncle still remembered him teaching him to fish. The brain tries to make sense of contradiction, and when it can't, it fractures, and those fractures never fully heal. In 2018, a team of geneticists from Dalhousie University received permission to analyze the Gola family's medical and genealogical records. It was supposed to be an academic exercise, a way to study the long-term genetic effects of sustained inbreeding in a human population. What they found was so disturbing that the lead researcher later admitted he wished he had never opened the files. The family tree they reconstructed was unlike anything in modern genetic literature. Lines crossed and recrossed so many times that the software used to map genetic relationships kept flagging errors. But there were no errors, just a biological reality that shouldn't exist. Children who were the product of 3, sometimes 4, overlapping incestuous unions. A boy whose father was also his great-uncle and half-brother. A girl whose mother was her aunt, her cousin, and her half-sister simultaneously. The researchers tried to create a visual representation, but it was incomprehensible. A tangle of lines that looked less like a family tree and more like a net closing in on itself. The genetic damage was measurable. Chromosome abnormalities, increased homozygosity, where harmful recessive genes had no healthy counterpart to suppress them. Entire sections of DNA that had been duplicated or degraded beyond normal variation. The children born in the final generation of the Gola clan had genetic profiles that more closely resembled isolated island populations that had been cut off from outside breeding for thousands of years. Except this hadn't taken thousands of years, it had taken less than 200. One of the geneticists described it like this. Imagine a deck of cards. In a healthy population, you shuffle and draw from a full deck. But the Golas were drawing from the same 10 cards, over and over for generations. Eventually, the deck stops functioning. The game becomes unplayable. That's what happened to their DNA. It stopped being viable. And the children paid the price, but the study revealed something else, something that made even hardened scientists pause. Several of the survivors, now adults, had gone on to have children of their own with partners outside the family. And even though those children were genetically diverse, they still showed higher than average rates of developmental issues. The damage wasn't just in one generation. It had embedded itself so deeply into the genome that it was still detectable 2, even 3 generations later. The Gola bloodline had been poisoned, and the poison was still spreading. The university sealed the study. It was too sensitive, too controversial, too dangerous to release publicly, because it raised questions no one wanted to answer. Questions about eugenics, about genetic screening, about whether some bloodlines are too damaged to continue. The researchers were told to move on, to study something else, and so the files were locked away again. Just like they had been in 1984, just like they had been for 200 years. But the story doesn't end with a locked file. It ends with the people still living it, the survivors who wake up every day in bodies that remember. The children born with genetic shadows they didn't ask for. The communities that still whisper the name Goler like a curse. This wasn't a dynasty. It was a slow-motion collapse. A family that turned inward until there was nothing left but damage and silence. And the most terrifying part, it could happen again. Right now, in isolated communities across North America, there are families living outside the system, beyond the reach of schools, hospitals, and social services. And no one is checking, no one is asking, because we've learned nothing. We still look away, we still say it's not our business, until one day a child runs barefoot through the woods, and the whole world is forced to see what we allowed to happen in the dark. The Gola clan is gone, but the lesson remains. Evil doesn't announce itself. It grows in silence, in isolation, in the spaces we're too afraid to look. And if we keep turning away, it will grow again,